I'm on now? See, this is what happens when you're a college president. You don't know how anything works. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Pam Eddiger, the president of Bunker Hill Community College, and I am thrilled to welcome you tonight to this wonderful conversation on a pivotal moment of American history right here in our community. Even as we look back on the Battle of Bunker Hill, we celebrate the community that we are now. All of us, city and college, friends and neighbors, United States and United Kingdom. When John Adams famously wrote to his wife, Abigail, in 1780, a few years after the Battle of Bunker Hill, that he must study politics and war so that his children might study mathematics and philosophy. He may very well have predicted the rise of community colleges and public education some 120 years before their advent. Today, Bunker Hill students, all 16,000 of them here, study mathematics and cybersecurity and marine technology and engineering and nursing, and yes, philosophy, among many other fields. Many of them are first-generation Americans, first-generation college-goers, and are driven to rise and make their own indelible contributions to our Commonwealth and our United States. I think John Adams would have been very, very pleased. So tonight, thank you to the Friends of the Charlestown branch of the Public Library, the Bunker Hill Monument Association, the British Consulate-General Boston, and the National Park Service of Boston for your vision and partnership. And to Nathaniel, Philbrick, Emma Hart, and Brooke Barbier. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us. And to wonderful Jacqueline Schwab. Jacqueline, where are you? There she is. One more round. I have said to our college community that there will always be music in Bunker Hill, and thank you for bringing music here for us tonight. And thank you to you, everyone who's in attendance. We hope that you will come back and visit us for an event, a game, or maybe even to take a class. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce one of Bunker Hill's own and our greatest friend and supporter, our distinguished alumni, Representative Dan Ryan, or Danny, as we call him, right? I get a hug.
Of course you do.
I get a hug.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To show my history degree here at Bunker Hill Community College, I have not only grown gray in service of my country, but also half blind, as George Washington said to the troops when they tried to take over the country, correct? I want to thank President Pam Eddiger in Bunker Hill Community College community. As she said, I am an alum of this college. It was a long, hard struggle, but I was supposed to be the first person to graduate in my family from college, and my 7-year younger sibling had 2 master's degrees before I graduated, but that's no knock on Bunker Hill Community College. But I actually growing up in Charlestown, I had an affinity for history. I got D's in math, so it took me a while. But there was one professor, Richard Clayman, who was one of the most inspirational people in my life. And I just kept taking history classes because he was so good. And it's funny because he was a Jewish guy, I think from Worcester, but he wrote a book about the Jewish community in Medford or Malden. And he reminded me of the Catholic nuns that I grew up with. And he would snap at us and he'd go, "Are you with me? Are you with me?" And he just kept history so interesting. But the biggest part about that was in the 1990s. And at the time, Russia had just broken up. And there was a ton of old Russian people who had immigrated to Massachusetts. And they were professionals in their own home country. And we'd go through 3 months of classes, and he would say to us, you have to do 2 of the 3 essay questions, but our Russian students only have to answer 1. And he said, if you don't like it, take the course in Russian. Okay? So as we look at the national scene today, and we think of Bunker Hill, and we think of the battle, and we talk about the battle, but it was a time of enlightenment. Joseph Warren, who we are going to in the next 2 weeks talk about what he did at Bunker Hill, he was not a fighter. He was not a soldier. He was a scholar. He was a doctor. They got the idea of revolution from the Enlightenment, who got the idea from the Greeks and the Romans. And that's what we carry on today. So when we talk about the free idea of what we're going to do here tonight, and this is why I'm so happy to be here. I am going to party like the rest of Charlestown, like you can't believe, for the next 10 days. Sorry. That's why, that's why I didn't cut it the first time at college, but that's okay. But this is why tonight is so important. This is the free exchange of ideas. And as we see our sister liberal college on the banks of the Charles, the small liberal college down there, who's getting attacked for letting people speak their mind, we have to think of these are the times that tried men's souls. That was an Englishman who wasn't supposed to be in this country that spurred us to revolution because he wrote an essay. And that's why the American government is afraid of us right now, because we are intellectual, we think, and this is what the Battle of Bunker Hill was all about. It was the culmination of people thinking on their own. So I was asked just to say what it is that the battle and the parade and all this means to me, and it just means this culmination of learning. And I do have to recognize a couple of people here in the audience. Tommy Ambrosino, the executive director of the Supreme Judicial Court, who was also the mayor of Revere. He was also the city manager of Chelsea, Massachusetts, when I represented Chelsea during COVID. The Massachusetts National Guard, who got their start in Bunker Hill and got their start in the Cambridge Common before we even had a country. Back during COVID, when we had certain people in this country denying the fact that inoculations could work, which, by the way, am I right, saved us at Valley Forge, because George Washington mandated that the exact same inoculation that Joseph Warren gave to the Adams children had to be administered at Valley Forge. Did that not happen? Thank you, Bunker Hill Community College. I told you I could raise in history. Hey! Chelsea, Massachusetts, our National Guard drove our school buses. They delivered food. They took care of the most vulnerable among us who now can't even show up to an immigration court. And I don't mean to be political. I'm just telling you how it is. That's why I can say this speech here, because we're in a free institution to exchange ideas. This is what Bunker Hill Community College is all about. It took me a long time to get out of here. I'm glad to be back. I love you for it. And not only that, we called because we were getting our field done over, our Little League field, and I called Bunker Hill. They said, we'll fix the field. They can play at our place. So thank you. I thought these notes were going to be short, but they're not. I want to thank the piano player, Jacqueline, as I said, Jacqueline Schwab. So my daughters took piano as kids. They got away from it. Then they got back because of YouTube, and they started learning all the songs that I know. So they started teaching me We Didn't Start the Fire. Sorry to the British Consulate, but that's the only song I knew. But now I only know Lean on Me, Brother. So we're back. All right? And I do want to thank the British Consulate. We've spent a lot of time together. We now lay flags for our fallen brethren of both the American and the British government because on the Bunker Hill Monument, because we were brothers and sisters at the time. It was a civil war. It was we were all fighting to get rid of the what do the kings call it? What do they call themselves? The divine right of kings. And again, it went back to the Magna Carta. Our fight was a 250-year-old fight that actually happened to culminate in Charlestown. So I just want to thank our British allies for that and for being our friends for the next 250 years. And then, so my wife wasn't sure if this tie was going to match the suit, but back to the Charlestown connection to this. So, and I have a book here that I'm going to have Nathaniel Philbrick sign, because this is my copy, but I was given a copy of this when I first got elected from Jimmy Collins, who was the state representative in the 1970s. So he gave me a copy that's in the State House. This one I'm going to have you sign so I can give to my friend, my lifelong friend, Joe Fitzpatrick, who's too cheap to buy one. All right? He's been waiting for the library to have it available. So I love that, and I also love Mayflower, which is a great book. But this tie, this is the greatest Charlestown story that ties into Bunker Hill. You're all sitting there going, where is this going to go? Is he going to land the plane? I know that. So I got the book from Jimmy Collins, who was the rep in the 1970s. I got this tie at the funeral of Gerard Doherty. He was a state representative in the early 1960s, became the chair of the Democratic Party. He was a scion of the Kennedy family. When you watch Ted Kennedy's funeral at our great chapel there on Mission Hill, he is sitting between three presidents, Gerard Doherty's guy in the middle. I went to his funeral, and the Morrises, Mrs. Morris and Mike Morris, they gave me this tie in the funeral line, in a gift bag. And I'm like, that is so Charlestown Irish, right? I got a gift at a funeral. And it was the Bunker Hill Monument tie. And that is who we are. That is what we do. We won't forget it. 250 years. It's community. It's revelry. It's learning. And I'm just glad everyone has pulled this all together. And thank you all. Thank you. And next up, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to introduce her or not, but I can't help but doing it. Elizabeth Cody from the National Park Service. I want to thank the National Park Service because another part of Charlestown history was urban renewal and a whole bunch of things that happened in the 1970s. And we could no longer, urban decay and everything else that you read about, we could no longer preserve that monument the way it should have been preserved. The National Park Service come in, and we sometimes treated them like they were an occupying army. And people like Ethan Baylor and folks like that, they spent their entire life interpreting our community history to the rest of the world. And we cannot forget that. Like we can go up there, we can walk our dogs, we can take a walk with our wife or our girlfriend. These folks have committed their life to telling our story to everybody else. And I want to just thank the National Park Service for that. That is how your tax dollars are spent. So I just want to, I'm sure I forgot some folks here, but I just want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank the opportunity for doing this. Like, I love running in the parade, but I do still like to learn, and I got that here at Bunker Hill Community College. I so much appreciate Japan. I appreciate this university. Gave me a chance to learn when, maybe I shouldn't have, but you guys gave me a chance. Thank you all.
Hey, folks, I know I am the last line between you and some incredible conversation, so I do want to thank you all so much for joining us here on this beautiful day, this beautiful evening. My name is Elizabeth Colby. I'm the Director for Visitor Experience and Engagement here with the 3 National Parks of Boston, where we have the profound honor of preserving and stewarding and interpreting the incredible sites along the Freedom Trail, the Black Heritage Trail, and Boston Harbor Islands. At these sites, we share the stories of the American Revolution and beyond, centering Boston as a city of revolution. Here in Charlestown, we proudly steward the Bunker Hill Monument, one of the most iconic sites in the American Revolutionary history. And tonight, we join our partners. Thank you so much to the British Consulate-General in Boston, to Bunker Hill Community College for hosting us, to Bunker Hill Monument Association, as well as the Friends of the Charlestown Branch Public Library. We are so looking forward to an incredible conversation. And I want to welcome our incredible hosts, our guests, Nathaniel Philbrick, Dr. Emma Hart, and Dr. Brooke Barbier. We are honored to have you, and I will pass it over to you, our moderator, who has earned her PhD here in Boston from Boston College, and the author of King Hancock, The Radical Influence of a Moderate Founding Father, which recently won the New England Historical Association Book Award, and is newly releasing a book titled Boston and the American Revolution, A Town versus an Empire. Thank you all for being here, and I join you in looking forward to the rich dialogue that so clearly defines this nation. Thank you.
Good evening. I have the pleasure to introduce the people to my right and left. Over here, we've got Emma Hart. Since 2021, Emma Hart has been the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History and the Richard S. Dunn Director of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her arrival in the United States, she taught colonial and revolutionary American history at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, for 20 years. She has written 2 books on Britain's American colonies in the 18th century and is currently researching a biography of the Scottish novelist and imperial booster Tobias Smollett. Welcome, Emma. To my left, someone I've admired for years, Nathaniel Philbrick is the National Book Award-winning author of 8 New York Times bestsellers, including 3 books about the American Revolution: Bunker Hill, Valiant Ambition, and In the Hurricane's Eye. He was born in Boston and lives on Nantucket Island, where he was the founding director of the Egan Institute of Maritime Studies. Welcome, Nat. As everyone has said so far, we're so appreciative of having you all come out here tonight as we begin the celebration of the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I'm thrilled to be moderating this discussion between 2 distinguished authors. I want us to start, though, by understanding what was happening prior to the Battle of Bunker Hill, because before June 17th, 1775, a lot had happened. Now, Boston had led the way in rebelling against parliamentary taxes, like the Stamp Act, like the townshend duties, but they're most famous for the way they rebelled against the Tea Act in 1773, and I bet you have an idea of what they did with that tea. After dumping it into the harbor, Parliament flipped out, and in 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts, and these acts were intended to punish not just Boston, but all of Massachusetts, and in fact, make an example of Massachusetts to the other colonies to dissuade them from being so bold. To enforce the Coercive Acts, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British North American Forces, becomes governor of Massachusetts. So a civil position is now held by a military man, and he brings thousands of troops into Boston. Boston, before the Tea Party, is about 15,000 inhabitants and a 2-mile island from tip to tip. It's a small town, and it becomes even smaller when all those redcoats occupy the town. In April 1775, we just commemorated another big anniversary with the battles of Lexington and Concord. And after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonists and the redcoats are now Boston becomes under siege, and the colonists surround Boston, and the Redcoats take over the city. Let's also talk about what hasn't happened by June 17th, 1775. General George Washington hasn't yet made it to Massachusetts. He was appointed just 2 days prior to the battle, and the Continental Army was created just 3 days prior. And we're going to get into who these people were that were fighting, but it's important to know that they were fighting without any intercolonial military leadership. Also, what hasn't happened, and what isn't going to happen for another year, is the colonies declaring independence. So while we're going to talk tonight, and I'm going to look at Nat here, the colonists versus the British, in fact, everyone was British subjects at this time. And again, we'll get more into that too. So let's dive in. We're going to talk about 3 topics today: the identity and culture of the people who participated. We're going to talk, of course, about the battle itself, and we'll talk about the way that the battle is remembered today. So beginning with identity and culture, Emma, I'm going to turn to you. Who were these British soldiers that were here occupying Boston and participating in the battle?
Okay, so before I launch into my answer, I just want to say my own set of thank you. So thank you for coming, and thank you to the British Consulate and to the Bunker Hill Community College and the National Park Service, and to my fellow panelists. I'm delighted to be here representing the British. But yeah, so your question is who were the British soldiers who? So they obviously had their leaders, Gage, and then also Howe as well, and Burgoyne was also in town. They all came on the boat across the Atlantic and set up camp in Boston. And so you've got a large army of thousands of British soldiers, some of whom had been in Boston for a while, and others who were gathering just before the battle from regiments that had come from elsewhere around the Atlantic. And so the regiments included all types of British men from across the British Isles. For example, the 47th Regiment, which I think was really instrumental in the battle. They were actually a Scottish regiment. They were founded in the Highlands, and a lot of their members had done work after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745 in enforcing British power, royal power in the Highlands. Others had fought already in the 7 Years' War. Some had seen action in the Caribbean, for example. So a lot of them were sort of seasoned soldiers, not just from England, but from Scotland and from Wales, from the north of England. So they were a pretty diverse group of Brits who had also quite often seen something of the world. They'd not, going to Boston was not their kind of first rodeo in the colonies. And they were also quite, at the time, the word that would have been used by people like Howe and Gage would be that they were a bit of a rabble, because a lot of British soldiers come from lower working class backgrounds, and it's a constant problem for the British leaders to find enough men who are willing to serve in the British Army and the Navy. So a lot of them would have been labouring men who were, had a very different outlook on life to their leaders, like Howe and Gage, who were members of the British aristocracy.
Thank you. Nat, how does that compare?
Well, it's a slightly different group on the American side. I mean, many of these primarily young men were descendants from the original Puritans who had arrived initially in 1630 to settle the city upon the hill, Boston, under John Winthrop. And with the outbreak of King Philip's War in 1675, there had been a series of wars with the native peoples throughout New England, and what would become the French and Indian Wars. And so many of these young provincials who lived in towns scattered around Boston had served in the military in one capacity or another, many of them in the French and Indian War alongside the British, where they were not necessarily highly respected. Although in some instances there was a real kind of comradeship. And, you know, so that these, and many of them have a real underlying resentment towards the British Empire. Their ancestors had been persecuted by the government for their religious beliefs. They had come here, and from their perspective, they didn't get much help from the government. Look what they did with it. You know, they settled all these towns, and then they fought alongside the British in the French and Indian War. But once that war was over and England had Canada, that threat wasn't there anymore. But then, you know, began to happen was the Boston Tea Party, and all of those hostilities that had been directed towards the North began to be directed towards British troops that were now occupying Boston. And they had been living cheek by jowl in Boston for a long time, and it did not go well. There was all sorts of confrontations going on. They got to know each other fairly well. Even the people from the country towns would come into Boston and have interactions there. And so, you know, they were known, but I think what happened was the Lexington and Concord. And that really, that began as a skirmish, but it was house-to-house fighting from Concord back to Boston as the British tried to make their way back. And you see the colonists referring to the British soldiers as bad as the Indians. It was really bringing up ancestral memories of, you know, what their ancestors had gone through. And so there was a certain amount of hostility there, particularly given that the city had been shut down. And they were experienced fighters. Each town had its own militia. They also had town meetings, and so they had grown up in a system of democracy that, you know, was not necessarily shared with their British counterparts. Where, you know, I live on Nantucket Island. We still have a town meeting. It's democracy at its bare-knuckle best, where, you know, people yell at each other over an issue for a certain amount of period of time, but then come to a mutually agreed upon decision. And so, you know, these were people who dressed in homespun. There were people who were well-to-do, but there wasn't that level of aristocracy that you saw in Britain, and so, you know, it was tense. Their city had been occupied, had been turned inside out. You know, Bostonians had evacuated, and now everyone is clustered around Boston, which is occupied by the British, and things are tense, and no one knows where it's going to go.
Resources are low, buildings are being leveled, any wood that could be salvaged from a fence or a barn is being taken. Emma, does the siege affect the British soldiers' views of the way they saw the Bostonians and the colonists?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that any friendliness that had evolved between them started to break down. And it's something that you can see happening as the British, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when they occupy other cities as well, is that there is quite a, you know, in the American Revolution, there's quite a lot of initial goodwill, but then as the resources get scarcer and you know, the colonists become less cooperative, the British also become less friendly and less welcome. So, for example, I mean, at the time of the Boston Massacre, there were definitely tensions between the British troops and the townspeople. But recently, another historian, Serena Zabin, has written a book about the massacre, which shows that actually quite a few of the local women married British soldiers, and they actually had children together. So this was like a sort of family affair, and you can also you can see that happening in other places where British soldiers are stationed. So there are these sort of fundamental ties, but as things get tenser, as more and more British troops arrive in the city, as you said, as the prices go up in the marketplace. When I was doing research for one of my books, I read an account in the Charlestown, South Carolina newspapers about how hungry the Bostonians were and how cruel the British were being, in that they wouldn't even let a boat of cabbages into the Boston market. They were really squeezing them, and that creates a sort of real pressure cooker environment.
Yeah, and that speaks to what you were saying too, Nat, about the right to self-government. Well, the Massachusetts Government Act, one of the coercive acts, denies that. And the ability to get fresh goods in the harbor, another coercive act. The Boston Port Bill denies that. And so you see that these laws that Parliament passed also inflame the tensions, and then the soldiers seem to embody the bad will that the coercive acts, they are literally embodying the bad will of the coercive acts.
And I think you can see that in one sense, Gage and his army are put into a very difficult position by Parliament, by these acts. And what's interesting to me is that the colonists were very proud to be British, the mother country. This was highly traumatic for them. They didn't want to split at this point. And in fact, what they did in their own minds was demonize Parliament, but convince themselves that the king was still on their side. You see that, which is fascinating when you think, here is proto-democratic society clinging to the king as this benevolent leader. How desperate they were, really. They didn't know that actually the king was driving it as hard as anyone was. But it's kind of sad almost that how desperate the colonists were to make this work in some way. It was not going that way given the coercive acts and what was unfolding. And
it is, to be fair, it's very easy for the colonists to make that separation, right? Because George III is a king. I think already the representative did referred to the divine right of kings, and kings are still, monarchs are still seen as an envoy from God on earth at this time. And then you also have this whole decades-long narrative of the corruption of British politics, of British politicians being corrupt. And some of them, like John Burgoyne, was also a British member of Parliament. And so it's easy for the colonists to see the ministers surrounding George as being corrupted by these corrupt politics, but obviously to put him outside of it. That's like a natural thing for them to do, given how kings versus ministers are conceived at the time.
But for us today, it's like,
what?
What were they doing?
What were they thinking?
What are they doing? They're going with the king rather than the legislature.
Yeah.
Let's switch to the battle. Let's get there. Nat, can you tell us about the preparation by the colonists for the battle, or the lack of?
Yes. The Battle of Bunker Hill, I think, what sets the stage is this is a battle that was named for the wrong hill. This battle began in confusion. It was fought not on Bunker Hill, it was fought on Breed's Hill. That means the Bunker Hill Monument is on Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill. It's the battle no one thought was really going to happen. Back in Cambridge, the original intention was they knew the British were about Howe and the other generals were about to stage an attack, to break out of Boston at some point. And before that happened, just days before that happened, they thought they should make a move of their own by building a fortification on Bunker Hill, which is actually a half-mile behind Breed's Hill. And it's not clear quite what happened. Prescott is nominally in charge, and he had orders to build on Bunker Hill. It was at night, the night of the 16th, bleeding into the 17th, but they end up much closer to Boston at Breeds Hill. If they had built something on Bunker Hill, it would have not been a big deal because any cannon over there couldn't have reached Boston. It would have just been a possible defense against a British army that was potentially attacking the American headquarters in Cambridge. But no, the Americans begin to build this redoubt on almost a stone's throw from Boston on Breeds Hill, overlooking the nearly abandoned town of Charlestown, and so they start building it, and it's at night, and the men who are doing it aren't even sure where they are exactly. Daylight comes, and they look around, and they go, "Holy, look at this! The whole British fleet is around us. Every one of those ships is full of cannons that potentially pointed right at them. There is Boston, right over there." We have one letter from someone who was there, Brown, saying, it seemed to us that, that we had been betrayed, that someone is out to murder us all. They're going, what the heck are we doing here? And so they start, okay, well, Prescott, who has been, and the British start firing their cannons. And so cannonballs are whistling through the air. Men develop the routine of diving down when they hear one coming. The cannonball goes up, then they get up and they start working again. Their leaders say, "Don't worry about cannonballs. They're scary, but they don't tend. They're not that bad until."
Until they're bad.
Until a poor Pollard gets his head knocked off. And they go, okay, can we trust these leaders? And the word goes back to Cambridge. Wait a minute, we need reinforcements. In Cambridge, they go, what? Why do you need reinforcements? Oh, you're not on Bunker Hill, you're on Breeds Hill. And from there, it begins to become an improvisational mess that goes amazingly well for the Americans, given how it started.
And what about, that's a beautiful way to set up how the British respond to this seeming threat by building a redoubt on Breeds Hill and not on Bunker Hill.
So, the British Army is obviously more professional, and although Gage is not the most skilled or trusted leader. I think wasn't there a rumor that his wife is American from New Jersey, and he has come back to the colonies reluctantly, and he doesn't really have the trust of his fellow leaders either, like Howe and Burgoyne. They're not really sure that Gage is the man for the job.
He seems too gentle.
Yes.
That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Is that,
He follows the rule of law.
Yeah.
And the colonists ignore it.
Yes.
And, make him look like a fool.
And he also is not straight enough with George III about how bad things are in the colonies, but fortunately, Howe is there, and Howe is a very skilled soldier. I think he's already sort of covered himself in glory during the 7 Years' War, and so he's also been responsible for some reforms in the British Army, which have made it a more nimble fighting machine. Because the British had really suffered during the 7 Years' War fighting in North America, because this was this is a very different type of warfare to the sort of set piece of, the Prussian army facing the British army in continental Europe. And so the British forces, although some of them are quite green, they are, a little bit more nimble, and they are able to mount an attack with fighters, but I think they get bogged down, don't they, in the water before they can land effectively, and so it's really, and of course the troops have become sickly and hungry because they've been camping out in Boston for a long time. So it's far from ideal. I also don't know, what was it's pretty hot today. How warm was it on June 16th?
It was a scorcher.
Yeah,
it was a lot like today, and the British soldiers are in wool uniforms.
Yes, yeah.
And they're out there in the broiling sun.
Yeah.
And and it takes 2 trips to get everybody over, so everything is moving very slowly. And meanwhile, up on the hill, the New England provincial leaders are arriving haphazardly, going, whoa, what's going on here? There's the redoubt there, but it's wide open all the way on the other side to the Mystic River. Let's start filling it in. And so someone from Putnam from Connecticut, shows up and starts helping with that. John Stark from New Hampshire, one of my favorite characters of this battle. Yes, live free or die. John Stark, an Indian fighter from way back, tough as nails. The New Hampshire legislature despises him because he won't kowtow to them, but his men love him. And he comes out and he looks and he realizes this is a total mess. What is going on here? We need to fill in over here. And what he really realizes, that over on the riverside, there's a beach underneath a bank, wide open for the British to send some soldiers down there, which happens to be Howe's plan, to send the Welsh Fusiliers, the greatest of the greatest, down that way. But what Howe doesn't realize, that Stark sends his men down, they pull together some rocks and create a wall just around the corner. And so that when Howe sends what should be a flanking movement that will just break this wide open, there is John Stark and his men. And one of the things that's tough about this kind of warfare with muskets and things like that, you had to be, if you're going to effectively kill someone, they had to be within 50 yards, if not closer. So, the famous phrase, don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. The phrase probably was, don't shoot till you see the whites of their gaiters, because the British soldiers wore gaiters on their feet. But whatever, Stark's men, knowing this was an issue, had put a stake in the sand saying, wait till the opponents get there before you shoot. And so they wait. The men come up and get mowed down over and over again. Bodies riddled lying on the beach. Stark compared it to dead sheep in a pen. And so that isn't going to work for the British. It's now going to be a battle on that hill, wide open, beneath the sun. And meanwhile, Charlestown is burning.
Yeah.
The order goes out because some of the American troops had gone into the houses of abandoned Charlestown and were firing on the British left flank as they tried to go in there. That causes the British fleet to fire on Charlestown with its cannons, and it goes up in flames. Burgoyne. Burgoyne is also one of my favorite characters. Here he is. He's a member of Parliament. He's also a playwright.
Yes.
And he has this wonderful letter where he is standing on Copp's Hill, which even today has a beautiful direct view of the monument. And he's watching Charlestown burn, this huge, and he describes a pyramid of fire as all the roofs of the churches are collapsing. The smoke it creates this dark cloud hovering over everything. Their swallows began to fly over the British soldiers as they were about to come. And Burgoyne in his letter says, and we began to wonder, what if we lose this thing? What will happen to the empire?
Well, they win the battle,
Yes.
but it's at an enormous cost. William Howe said of the high number of casualties, the success is too dearly bought. What lessons, Nat, you write in Beacon Hill about how Howe knew after this battle he needed to get out of Boston. He and his troops needed to evacuate. Emma, can you speak more to that, about the mindset after the battle? Because Lexington was a skirmish, and the colonists lost that battle. They won the Battle of Concord, and while they lost ultimately the Battle of Bunker Hill in that they lost the high ground, the British suffered a near 50% casualty rate, dead or wounded. So what's the mindset after?
Well, I don't think the British could really, they definitely couldn't conceive of leaving and losing. I mean, the fact that the Americans put up such a great fight was, of course, a huge shock to them. I mean, what's always fascinating to me is reading what British people, what British politicians and leaders said about Americans, both in the 1750s and the 1760s. You know, they are really snotty towards them. They really think that they're inferior, you know, provincial, which is a huge insult during the Enlightenment, you know, to not be sort of cosmopolitan. And so they seriously, I mean, I can't imagine, you know, I haven't sort of looked at Howe's letters precisely, but it's a shock to them, and they can't really believe that the Americans are this good and this talented. And you know, it's not like they haven't been warned, because one of my favorite sort of colonial characters is Thomas Pownall, who is a former governor of Massachusetts. And he writes a book in the early 1760s, before even the Stamp Act, telling the British rulers that they really need to change their outlook about Americans. But the British just don't listen. And so that, I think, is reflected in what Howe does after the battle, is that, you know, he doesn't leave Boston, he stays there, because, you know, he stays until March 1776. The British troops stay there until they finally realize that they don't really have an alternative except to pack up and leave, because they're not going to get anywhere. But I think that is sort of indicative of how fixed their mindset was about Americans, but also how they are unable to sort of think creatively about what they would do with this situation, because it's so shocking to them, but also just because of their own, you know, preconceptions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how the Battle of Bunker Hill really established the template that would be repeated over and over again, where the British would win the battle, and they would move to, let's say they moved to New York next, and they had this total hope that the Loyalists would turn the tide for them, that, you know, they'd bring the Loyalists in, and the colonists would realize the error of their ways, and place by place would begin to come back into the fold of the mother country. But just the opposite happened. Emma, just like what you're saying happened to Boston. They come down, the armies come down like locusts, picket, you know, destroy, they burn New York City, and then they move on.
Yeah.
And suddenly the Loyalists are left unprotected, and the Patriots rise, and it's just this horrible civil war in the wake of wherever the British go. And it just repeats itself until finally, years later, they're down in the South and doing the same thing. Yeah, so Bunker Hill established so much. And I also think Howe is a very interesting character. I mean, he was at the front, he led his men at Bunker Hill. I mean, he was up there, you know, marching right up there. All the officers around him are killed. He's standing there by himself in this magnificent coat. It's amazing he didn't die. But then in other battles, whether it's in Brooklyn and then you know, other places, you wonder if that experience had, you know, at the Battle of Brooklyn, he's on the verge of getting them, you know, at the fort there, but he decides he can't lose that many men. And, you know, I've always wondered, is it because I won't call it trauma, because if you're a general, you don't experience trauma, but what he experienced there prevent him from delivering a knockout punch in other situations?
Because he would never come close again. New York was as close as Howe was going to, both Howes, Richard and William, the brothers, had converged with 40,000 troops. That was their best shot.
Yeah.
And yet, so it is a wonder if Bunker Hill was lingering in his mind.
Yeah.
But George Washington squirrels away and...
Yeah, and that's the other fascinating thing is George Washington isn't there.
Yeah.
You know? And I have to give a shout out to Joseph Warren. who was, I mean, this was an incredible leader, a brilliant speaker, and who, there was a loyalist would later say if Joseph Warren had left, George Washington would have been basically a nobody. I think that's overstating the case, but for me, the what if is if Joseph Warren had lived. Washington comes up. He had real problems dealing with the New Englanders. They weren't used to the hierarchical society of plantation South, and it got really kind of ugly. They would eventually, as the war dragged on, it would work out. But I've often wondered if Warren had been there, it could have been Warren and Washington together, I think, would have been pretty magnificent.
When I was writing my biography of John Hancock, one of the times I actually cried when reading the resources was a letter from John Hancock the day after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he's writing to Joseph Warren. And I know that Joseph Warren has died the day before, but Hancock doesn't. And he writes to him to say, George Washington has been appointed general, make space for him, you're gonna like him, he's a nice guy. So get prepared for him. And these are those moments where you're reading this and you think, oh, how devastating when Hancock would find out that he wrote this letter to someone who had died. I have full chills. Let's close with memory, and we'll start with Joseph Warren, because the Battle of Bunker Hill lingers today, at 250 years later, almost. And so how does the battle live on in Americans' memory? How has that changed over time? And then what's the role of Warren as the memory of the battle?
Yeah, the Battle of Bunker Hill is something right up there with, Washington. It's the battle I think a lot of people think of when they think of the quintessential Revolutionary War battle. It's the bloodiest one that would be fought. Yes, Yorktown sort of ended things, but Bunker Hill, there's countless ships that have been named Bunker Hill. There's Bunker Hills would spring up. There would be a Bunker Hill in New York City soon after the battle. And Joseph Warren was someone, talk about a collective trauma. Losing him in New England was devastating. There are towns across America named Warren in honor of him. I think today he's known in Charlestown and in Boston, but generally he's off the radar. He didn't live to become one of the founding fathers, but in many ways I think Joseph Warren is the one that he was in charge of the revolution from the American side when it was a revolution. It was things were just happening. No one knew where it was going. It was crazy. And you got to remember, in New England at this time, if you were from Braintree, you didn't necessarily like someone from, Milton. It was that kind of, the New Hampshire, Connecticut, forget it. Warren was trying to hold this group together at a very volatile and difficult time. And so I think he's just underappreciated for getting it, basically delivering things to George Washington, who would then have a whole nother set of challenges. And for me, the Bunker Hill Monument is talk about a living embodiment of a battlefield, a memory, this solitary needle on the hill. It was great when the Zachem Bridge echoed those. When I saw that, I said, "Oh, yes." And I think the whole Charlestown with the Navy Yard. That for me, there's Copp's Hill. That's one of the other great sacred historic spots. But you go to Copp's Hill and you look over there. That's the cosmic connection that defines so much of what Boston and this area was as it was torn by a revolution.
Emma, what strikes me too about the memory of the American Revolution generally is that the British Empire goes on to become even more powerful in the 19th century. George III reigns for another 45 years. So even though they lose the Revolutionary War, catastrophic losses in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British Empire thrives into the next century.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, it's not that the British aren't talking about Bunker Hill, you know, immediately after. If you, you know, read British newspapers of the time, they are, you know, fervently reporting on the losses, and they're describing it as a civil war as well. I mean, one of the first reports in the London newspapers about a month after the action, because obviously that's how long it takes the news to get over there, it describes it as a dreadful civil war. And so people are very concerned about the revolutionary activity in Britain. And not least because there's a lot of sympathy for the Americans in Britain at the time. Thomas Paine is the perfect example, right? He has already arrived in America in 1774, I think, sent over here came over with the help of Benjamin Franklin. And he's representative of this real kind of radical sentiment in British politics that's gathering pace across the whole country, and which is, you know, bringing in lots of Britons who are really as fed up with the British hierarchical system, with the lack of liberty they believe that they have, as many of the Americans as well. But, I mean, they're destined to be not the main story for the British during this period, as you hinted at. There's so much else going on in India. So Burgoyne is actually, he's a couple of years before he came to fight at Bunker Hill, he's interviewing Warren Hastings, who goes on to be the governor of the East India Company, because they're trying to reform the East India Company, which is in debt, which is, you know, one of the big cash cows for the British Empire. They're also focusing on keeping their Caribbean colonies out of the hands of the French as well. So there's also, they have in 1772, we have the Somerset case, which was tried, a very famous case tried in Britain, in which the ultimate upshot of that is that slavery is illegal in Britain itself. It's not okay to keep African people in slavery in Britain. So these are all sort of concerns that are swirling for the British. And in the end, you know, the American, you know, what happens to the 13 colonies kind of fades into the background for a very long time, actually. Even still in the British school curriculum, which I went through, you don't ever learn about the American Revolution. It's not mentioned. So, yes.
We're not a big deal.
Yeah. But of course you are a big deal now.
Well, thank you. We'll end this discussion now here, and then if you all have questions, there's a microphone here and here, and we're asking that people come up when the microphone is free rather than gathering in a line. And Emma and Nat will be happy to take your questions for a few minutes.